My guess is that a lot of people on the call have heard of Arminius, and they've heard of the controversy of Calvinism and Arminianism. But my guess is they probably don't know much about Arminius himself. Can you give us a quick sketch of the life of Jacob Arminius?
Sure. The same year that the definitive edition of Calvin's Institutes came out in 1559 was the year that Jacob Arminius, which is his Dutch name, which is Latinized as Arminius, he was born. And so sometimes it's pitched as if Arminius and Calvin knew one another, and they didn't. Their lives only overlapped very briefly, and there was no interaction really between them. But that being said, Arminius grew up, and one of his mentors saw that he showed intellectual promise, and so underwrote his education. He studied at a number of different institutions, and for a time, he studied at the Academy of Geneva under, the instruction of Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor there at Geneva. And so he studied at a number of different institutions, and then finally took up a pastorate after passing his ordination exams in 1587, and he even received a really positive commendation from Theodore Beza, his professor at Geneva. And so I think initial reports were quite positive, and everybody thought, okay, this is a good student, and now he'll be a good minister. And like most seminarians, it's kind of like, this may sound boring to some, but you want a graduating seminarian to be like the airline schedule. Nobody hears about the airline schedule because millions of planes take off and land every day. You don't want it to be, oh, that plane didn't make it. And that's kind of the way it happened with Arminius, is that I think they hoped that he would go off to serve the Lord. And that's not what happened. Is that when he was in his pastorate, he first started teaching on Romans 7, among other things. And the common Reformed view is that Paul is talking about the regenerate Christian struggling with his sin, and in particular Paul. And Arminius took the opposite opinion, that no, this is an unregenerate person struggling with his sin. And so that created, a bit of a stir. Shortly thereafter, about 10 years later or so, the Black Plague struck the Netherlands, and two of the professors there at the University of Leiden, contracted the plague and died. And so that meant that the university was looking for a new professor, and they hired Arminius. But one of his colleagues there, Franciscus Gomarus, really did not. He had questions about Arminius's theology, and he objected to his appointment. Nevertheless, he was still appointed. And shortly thereafter, after he was appointed, there was some other controversies that came up from Arminius, and that a lot of folks don't know this, but his doctrine of the Trinity, and in particular the doctrine of Christ, he comments and basically rejects the idea that he is autotheos, that he is God himself, and that there's a sense in which he characterizes Christ as being, or the Son as being, subordinate to the Father ontologically. And so that created a stir, and that created some controversy. But then, in addition to that, there were also questions about his doctrine of justification, but then it was really his doctrine of predestination that was kind of like the spark that lit the fire and started the big controversy going. And he and Gomarus, would kind of battle these things out in the faculty and amidst the students and in their theological disputations. And the last disputation that Arminius conducted at the University of Leiden was on the doctrine of perseverance, which I treat in the book. Gomarus was there. They exchanged words. And shortly thereafter, a few months thereafter, Arminius himself succumbed to tuberculosis. He died. And so he died in 1609. And so I think that many perhaps hoped, okay, well, hopefully his teaching will go with him. but that wasn't the case. And by that point, he had persuaded a number of ministers and pastors and even a few professors at different institutions that this was, his understanding of things was the right way to go. And so they lodged what's known as a Remonstrance, which is an official kind of inquiry or protest with the States General, the magistrate there in the Netherlands, that they presented the 5 points of Arminianism. And that, of course, led a number of years later to the response from the Synod of Dort with what has now been called the 5 points of Calvinism. But so that's kind of a quick thumbnail sketch. There are more details, and I could direct people to Carl Bangs' biography of Arminius.